Hello all, we're going to start the Unit 2 anatomy here, and yes, I am recording at home, and our air conditioning system is currently not working, so all the windows are open, and so Bert and Ernie, my dachshunds, are going crazy pretty frequently every time they hear something outside. So there might be some background barking sound effects, just try to ignore those. Okay, so for Unit 2, the anatomy is going to consist of identification and some characteristics of basic tissues that make up the body, and that information comes from Chapter 4. And then we will take a look at some of the micro anatomy of the skin, the integumentary system. And the reason I'm calling that microanatomy, really our tissue anatomy is microanatomy as well, is because we're looking at things down at a microscopic level rather than at a naked eye level, which, if you recall, that is called gross anatomy when you're checking things out that are visible to the naked eye. Okay, so some of this information is going to overlap with the physiology lectures from Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, and so I'm going to try to just stay focused on the anatomy information that you need to know. I would use your Unit 2 anatomy study guide that's posted on Blackboard, follow along with that. And you might want to print out the full PowerPoints for the tissues and the skin anatomy so that you can follow along with me, because what I've done here in the PowerPoint is I've just left a lot of images unlabeled, and I'm going to fill those in as I talk about them. So again, I'm going to primarily focus here in the anatomy section just on what the parts are and how to identify them. All right. So now, if you have already started the physiology lectures about tissues, then you know that the body, tissues, again, we've moved up the levels of organization. From Chapter 2, we talked about basic chemistry, atoms and molecules. Then we moved up from there to cells in Chapter 3. And if you remember your levels of organization, cells make up tissues. Cells and additional filler spaces in between those cells, which we called the extracellular matrix back in Unit 1. Those are the components of tissues. And then the body is built from 4 major tissue types. Now, there are subdivisions of those 4 different types, which you'll learn about during this part of the course. But in general, everything in your body is built from these 4 different kinds of tissues that are woven together, kind of like fabrics, as your textbook is referring to them as, to build all the different structures in the body. And then the unique combinations for how they're put together determines the function of that particular organ or anatomical structure. All right, so your 4 major tissue types are nervous tissue, muscle tissue, and again, there's more information about that on the physiology lectures. The 2 that we're going to spend really the most time on are epithelial tissues and connective tissues. I wish there was some way I could set this iPad to stay in pen drawing mode when I go from one slide to another. Epithelial tissues and connective tissues are the other 2 major types. Epithelial tissues, you find those at boundaries where you have borders between compartments in the body, or the skin is a type of epithelial tissue, the outermost layer of the skin, because that is a boundary between the inside and the outside of the body. Connective tissues make up the majority of the tissues in the body. They have many different roles. Among those are support, binding different parts of the body together, and they serve as filler tissues between different locations. And again, there's going to be more information about that on the physiology lectures. All right, so we're going to talk about epithelial tissues first, just some basic characteristics of epithelial tissues. They consist of, the cells in an epithelial tissue are generally tightly packed together, so you won't have a lot of gaps between the cells. So there's not a lot of extracellular matrix. That would be the space in between the cells. there are two main types that you have based on where they're located. Many of your epithelia, that's the plural of epithelium, and epithelial tissue can also be called an epithelium. You will find them on external surfaces, the skin, and then internal surfaces. Any place in your body where you have an opening of some type, the lining is going to be an epithelial tissue. So if it's inside your mouth, inside a blood vessel, inside the intestinal tract, inside a lymphatic vessel, the lining of the cranial cavity, the inner lining of your serous membranes, all of those are composed of epithelial type tissue. And then your glands are structures in the body that produce substances and then secrete them, release them to go do their jobs. And those types of structures, for example, like your pituitary gland and your thyroid gland and your adrenal gland, and the salivary glands from Unit 1 that you had to identify for the anatomy test, all of those are composed of what we call glandular epithelia. So glands are built from a specialized type of epithelial tissue. All right, let's move on. So there are several different types of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is a broad category, and then you have different types, and the way they are classified, you have to ask two questions. One of those, and then some of this info is repeated on the physiology lectures, so you can scroll past it if you've already heard that. How many layers of cells do you have? Okay, so if you have an epithelial tissue in the body and it's just one layer of cells, all right, and then you go below there and you're moving into a different type of tissue, which is essentially always going to be some sort of connective tissue that the epithelial tissue is attached to. If you have just one layer of cells, that's called a simple epithelium. If you have multiple layers of cells, all stacked on top of each other, that make up that lining, wherever it's located, then that's called a stratified epithelium. So simple means one layer, stratified means more than one layer, and often it's a whole bunch of layers. Okay, so if we look at these diagrams from your textbook, so if you saw these on a lab test, I said identify whether the type of epithelial tissue you see here, and this one is a simple epithelium, and this one is a stratified epithelium, because you can see that the cells here are in multiple layers. Little purple spots in there are nuclei, and if you were looking at tissues under the microscope, you would look for those purple spots, because tissues, when you have a thin tissue slice and it's on a slide and you're looking at it under the microscope, the dyes that they apply to the tissues, the nuclei stain with a dark purple dye. So typically when you're looking under the microscope at tissues, you'll see spots like that. And then, of course, here's your border in between individual cells, and so you can see that there is really little to no space in between those cells. All right, so then the other thing that you use to classify epithelial tissues is the cell shape. All right, and this really should be the shape of the cell. Squamous means flat, like squash or squished. Cuboidal, cube-shaped, and columnar, column-shaped. The cells, if you were looking at them in 3 dimensions, would more or less look like a cylinder or a column. Okay, so what you do is you put those two names together, the layering and the shape name, and that helps you identify the type of epithelial tissue that you're looking at. And one little note: if you had, let's say you had a tissue that looked like this, for example, where you had a few layers of flat cells and they were sitting on top of some cube-shaped cells, and this was an epithelial tissue that kind of looked like that. What would you call that? Because it's a stratified tissue because it's layered, so it's stratified. But then you have two different cell shapes in there, and so the convention is to use the layer name that's in the apical position. Apical means that it's facing the interior space if it's inside the body, or the air on the outside if you're on the outside of the body. That's the apical side, and I go into more of that on the physiology lecture, so I won't repeat it here. So you would call this a stratified squamous epithelial tissue, even though you do have some cube-shaped cells down deeper. All right, so some pictures from your textbook of different cell shapes, just to review. All right, so this is a flat-looking cell. I'm not real crazy about these pictures from your textbook because they kind of look like chiseled pieces of wood, and cells don't really look like that, but we'll go with it. So if we have a flat cell, what's our term for that? Squamous. This would be a cube-shaped cell. So this is what it would look like in 2 dimensions, like if you were looking at it on a 2D slice of tissue under a microscope. And then, of course, this is your 3D representation. So that's going to be cuboidal. And then finally, we have the cells that are longer than they are wide, and so those are going to be called columnar epithelial cells. All right, so let's take a look at some imagery of example epithelial tissues from your textbook. And I do want you guys to be able to recognize and name these tissues based on these diagrams. And the reason for that is not so much that in the future you're going to spend a lot of your time identifying different types of tissues under the microscope or from pictures, but by having you study what these tissues look like, if you're like me, you may be a visual learner and you really have to see things to understand them. And so by having to learn this, it really makes you study the tissues and how they're laid out and understand how they're constructed. So when that information continues to come up throughout the course as we study additional body systems, it's going to make a whole lot more sense to you if you actually spend the time and learn how a few of these tissues are constructed. So that's the purpose behind what we're doing. And I'm just going to use the images from the textbook to keep things simple and straightforward. I just want you guys to have spent some time looking at these tissues and understanding how they are laid out. All right, so this is a picture from your textbook. Now over here, they have a pretty good diagram of this example type of tissue. So if you look at that tissue, what's our cell shape there? Our cell shape is squamous. Those are flat cells. All right, and then do you see one layer or do you see multiple layers of cells there? The cells are really just the yellowish portion there with the nuclei on the inside. So that's one layer. That's going to be a simple squamous epithelium. When you name a tissue, you always want to include when you name an epithelial tissue, you always include the epithelium part on the end so that it's clear what you're talking about. The pink stuff on the diagram, I talk about that on the video lecture, on the physiology lecture a little bit more. That's called the basement membrane, which is not composed of cells. It's composed of substances that help attach that epithelial tissue, that lining, to the additional tissues that are deep to it, that are underneath it. Okay, so now the pictures you see on these diagrams from your textbook like this, those are examples of what you would see if you were looking at these tissues under the microscope. And this is actually, and what they do with these tissues is they make super thin slices through the organ that is where the tissue is located, and then they apply dyes to it so that you can see the components of the tissues better. And they use 2 dyes. They use a red one and a purple one, and different substances bind those 2 dyes differently. So for example, DNA and RNA bind the purple dye really strongly, and so that's why the nuclei of the cells will show up dark purple when you're looking at these tissue images, because DNA is mainly located in the nucleus of cells, so it takes up a lot of that purple dye. Proteins, on the other hand, love the pink dye, so any place where you have a lot of proteins will appear pink. So that's going to include the cytoplasm of cells, and And when you're looking at other types of tissues, your connective tissues, where you have a lot of extracellular matrix and there's a lot of protein fibers located in there, that part of a tissue will be colored pink as well. So anyway, it's just done that way to kind of help you see see a little bit more of the detail in those tissues. All right, so what you're looking at here on this particular slide, and if you've already seen the physiology discussion, I cover this on there as well. This is a slice through in the lungs. They're showing you over here where this tissue came from, the lungs. You have these little tiny microscopic air sacs that are called alveoli, which you don't have to know that now. You'll learn that when you get to Biology 202. So what they do, if you can picture this, these are round little spheres. They're microscopic. They're air-filled sacs. Those are the locations where oxygen gas and carbon dioxide get exchanged with your blood. So what they do is they make like a slice through these three-dimensional air sacs, and then they take that super thin slice, put it on a slide, put these dyes on. So what you're looking at here is a cross-section through a bunch of those alveoli, those little tiny air sacs. So if you imagine like an air sac being like a tennis ball, if you cut through a tennis ball and then you were looking at it on the side, you would be looking at something that's more or less round. So what you're seeing here in purple like this, that is the edge of one of these air sacs. And you're looking at it in cross section. Now it's not perfectly round, it's more, has this kind of warped shape. And then here's another one over here, and then here's another one over here, and here's another one over here. So where the dye has been taken up, you have cells there. So cells make up the lining of those little air sacs. And if you look there closely at that image, you can see how thin it is. Those cells are super, super thin. There's only one, the layer is one cell thick that makes up that whole lining of those air sacs. And so that's an example of where you have simple squamous epithelium. And again, on the physiology lecture, we'll talk more about the functions. You know, why do you have such a thin tissue like that? What would be the purpose of that? Now you might be able to figure out, well, if it's in the lungs and you're having to exchange gases between the air and blood, you want the tissue to be super thin there so that the oxygen gas and the carbon dioxide can move back and forth between the air and your bloodstream. All right, so we'll move on now to the next type of epithelial tissue there on your anatomy study guide. So if you look at our representation over here from your textbook, you see a grouping of cells there that are making up this tissue. And do you see one layer of cells there or multiple layers of cells? Looks like one layer to me, so this is going to be a simple epithelial tissue. And then hopefully you can see that the cells have a rectangular or columnar shape. So this is going to be a simple columnar epithelium. And again, the pinkish or purplish, pinkish purple border down there on the bottom is called the basement membrane, and that is what is attaching that simple columnar epithelium to the tissues underneath it, which are connective type tissues. This picture that you see over here is what it would actually look like under the microscope after you apply dyes to it, and this actually came from the small intestine, this particular picture. And so what you're seeing on here, like right there, there's one cell, there's another, and you're looking at another portion of the single cell layer over here. The darker pink stuff you see down in on those edges would be your basement membrane here, and then you're getting into some connective tissues underneath there within the wall of the small intestine. Okay, and then this little white area in here would be some of the space inside the small intestine. And the reason this looks like, okay, so you've got lining of the small, the space inside your small intestine is not that microscopic. You are zoomed in into one of the lining, an area of the lining of the wall of the small intestine, and that lining, the surface, kind of wiggles back and forth like this, which you'll look at in more detail when you study the digestive system, and that helps increase the surface area you have for absorption of nutrients and water. And so that's what you're seeing there. You've got like a little up and down wiggle along the inside lining of the small intestine, and you've got just a little bit of space between two of those little hills there. Okay, darker spots, darker purple, we said those were where you see dark purple like that. There's usually DNA or RNA there, and or both, like you would have in the nucleus of a cell. So those are the nuclei of those individual cells. All right, let's take a look at this epithelial tissue. So if we check out our representation that you see over here, that looks like a single layer of cells to me. So this is going to be a simple epithelium. Those cells look cube-shaped to me, so it's going to be a simple cuboidal epithelium. That's how you would name that tissue. Don't panic. I'm not going to have test questions where I'm just showing you the tissue images. Since you guys are not working with microscopes in the laboratory, we're not going to do that. In a traditional class, you might have to do that. I will always include both this type of picture and this type of picture when I ask you to identify these on the lab test. As our little image over here is showing you, this example picture of the tissue comes from the kidneys, and the kidneys filter your blood and produce urine, and that production takes place inside, as you'll learn about in Biology 202. There are very tiny microscopic tubes or tubules that extend throughout much of the kidneys. And what you're seeing in this picture over here is you've got all these wiggly microscopic tubules that are involved in the formation of urine, and those have been cut through like this. They've been sectioned through. So if you can imagine those tubes being in 3 dimensions, and they've been cut through, and then you're like looking down on top at this 2-dimensional slice through those tissues. Like imagine if you had a garden hose and it was all wadded up and folded up, and then you cut evenly across a big wad of hose, and then you look down on top of it where the blade, whatever you used to cut through the hose, had cut through the hose, you would see a series of circles where the hose was cut open, and that's what you're seeing here in the kidney. So everywhere here where you see a dark purple spot, that's actually a nucleus inside those cells. And the individual cells, if you look closely, you can see borders between individual cells, and they do more or less have a cube shape to them. So that's why that's called a simple cuboidal epithelium. All right, now if you saw a picture of many layers of cube-shaped cells, what would that be called? That would be a stratified cuboidal epithelium, and you do have that type of tissue along certain linings in the body. Okay, the next one is a little bit different. So if you look closely at that little chunk of cells there, that epithelial tissue that we're taking a look at, what do you think? Is that a single layer, or is it more than one layer? I don't know about, to me it kind of looks like it's more than one layer, but actually this is not. This is actually a simple epithelial tissue. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to call it a simple epithelial tissue. It is a simple epithelial tissue because it's one layer, but because it looks like it's more than one layer, we're going to scratch this out. It has its own special name, pseudo, which what does pseudo mean? That means false. This is a pseudo stratified tissue. False stratified. It looks stratified, it looks layered, but it's not. What you have here is all of these cells in that tissue are all twisted and around each other. And so some of the individual cells in that layer are kind of squeezed down, others are sort of squeezed up, and it gives you the false impression of being a stratified epithelial tissue when it's really a simple epithelial tissue. So because of that, it's called pseudo-stratified. The cells are columnar in shape. It's just, a lot of them are kind of twisted around each other like that. So that can be kind of hard to tell. So this is a pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. The example that we're seeing over here comes from the inside lining of the trachea. So the lining of that space inside your trachea has this particular type of tissue on it. It has this pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. That's what you're seeing here. So here's the border in this picture between that lining on the inside of the trachea, and so down in here you're within the wall of the trachea itself. Remember, you're at a microscopic level here. So down in here you have connective tissues. All right, and then so for example here, like there's a nucleus, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one. And you can kind of see some of the borders in between these individual cells. Looking there closely, and they're all twisted around each other. This would be the air up in here, the space inside the trachea. You notice all these little hairy looking things there on the surface. Oh, and on the physiology video I do tell you too that there's another name for spaces inside the body. Any space you have in a compartment of any kind can be called a lumen. So the space inside a blood vessel is the lumen, the space inside the trachea is the lumen. Even down inside a cell, the space inside an organelle like the endoplasmic reticulum is called a lumen. So you'll see that term used in your textbook fairly frequently. So these little hair-like projections, let me erase this stuff because it's getting kind of overdrawn there. These little hair-like projections, if you guys remember from chapter 3 when we went over cell structures, those are cilia. Those are built from proteins that are capable of whipping back and forth like that. And what those cilia do is they have a lot of mucus on them, and when you breathe in dust, bacteria, things like that, you have a lot of mucus up here along the lining, which traps those types of things for you, hopefully, so that they don't go down here deeper into your lungs. That would not be a good thing. And what the cilia do is they constantly brush upward and send that stuff back upward towards your pharynx. And once it's in the pharynx, hopefully you're going to cough it out or swallow it down into your stomach. But those are called cilia, and you do have that on the pseudostratified columnar epithelium that lines your trachea. So the full name for that tissue is actually pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And you have that in your trachea. Throughout a lot of your upper respiratory tract, like along your nasal cavity as well, you have those little cilia there that are brushing things back toward your pharynx so that you'll either cough them out or swallow them down into your stomach acid and destroy them. All right, how about our next one here? This is, let's see. This is actually a representation of a tissue chunk from, if we look over here on this picture, oral cavity, the pharynx, and then on down into the esophagus, if you can tell that from that sagittal section, through the head and neck there. All right, so here's our little tissue chunk. And so what do you think about this one if you're looking at it closely? Most of the cells in that tissue chunk are flat, so they're squamous. Now if you look down near the bottom, the deeper portion, the cells take on more of a cuboidal appearance. But when you have a multi-layered tissue like we have here, this is a stratified tissue, you always name it according to the cell shape at the top. Or, well, it's better not it's better not to say the top, but at the apical surface. The apical surface is what faces a lumen or the outside of the body. So this is going to be a stratified squamous epithelium. All right, and this is what it would look like if you were checking it out under the microscope. So this would be like space inside the oral cavity or inside the esophagus. That would be the lumen. And down in here is the deeper border of the epithelial tissue right along in there. Let me change pen colors so that we can see it better. Right along in there, that's your lower border. And then now down in here, you're getting into connective tissues. So epithelial linings are always glued down to connective tissues underneath, because connective tissues bind things, they connect one type of tissue to another within the body. They serve as filler spaces. So you're always going to have an epithelial tissue attached to an underlying connective tissue. All right, and you can see, so even the nuclei in these cells look flat and squished because they're so squamous. So individual cells might look like that within these tissues. The cytoplasms of the cells on these tissue diagrams stain pink, and sometimes it's very difficult to see borders between individual cells. Now down in here at the bottom, you've got lots of nuclei in there, and the cells again are really more cube-shaped down in here. This is also what your skin looks like, so you'll see a lot more tissue representations that look like that as you study the skin in Chapter 5. All right, the last type of epithelial tissue that I want you guys to be able to recognize is this one. This is another unusual type, and this is the type of epithelial tissue you would have lining spaces inside organs, some of the organs within your urinary system. So it lines the inside spaces of your ureters and also the urinary bladder. All right, and so this tissue has this sort of appearance. So you can see you have some mixed cell shapes in there. And what happens with this particular tissue, if you think about the ureters and the bladder are going to expand like this when they fill up with urine, and they're going to contract back down like this when you empty the bladder and you don't have urine inside. So because of that, the epithelial linings in there get stretched out a lot, and then they contract. They stretch out and they contract. And so this type of epithelial tissue is kind of unique because the cells in it actually change shape themselves. They're not quite as rigidly structured in terms of their shape. Okay, so because of that one, like when the bladder fills up, here's your epithelial tissue lining here. So all of that is your epithelial tissue. This would be connective tissue down in here. And your epithelial layer there, it is a stratified type epithelial tissue. As if the bladder gets stretched out, those cells would get squished. As the bladder empties, those cells will relax and go back to the shapes that you really see there in that picture. So this one has its own name. This is called transitional epithelium because the cell shape undergoes transitions as the bladder fills up or relaxes, or as your ureters fill up or relax, depending on how much urine is passing through. Alright, so I'm actually going to stop this video lecture there, and I'm going to do a separate video lecture on the different types of connective tissues that I want you guys to be able to recognize for the Unit 2 anatomy test.